just yesterday we saw something that to me is incredibly fascinating.
Okay, but you have to be rational.
I will be very rational. I'll just say that there are potential highs and lows to what has happened here. I don't really have a feeling about it because I don't know what's going to happen. But Charles, you are the lay person relative to the way that Amanda and I talk about this stuff.
Yes.
So yesterday, Sony bought Alamo Drafthouse, which is the 7th largest theatrical movie theater chain in America. They have 35 theaters in 25 cities. They have gone through some difficult financial times since the pandemic. They were kind of recapitalized by private equity, but for years were owned independently, based out of Austin. And they're well known, of course, for their dine-in options, for their kind of irreverent approach to movie experience, but they're also very reverential towards watching movies, being quiet,
spent 24
no cell
hours
phones.
in one.
Did you?
Eating nothing but Alamo Drafthouse food. So
How did that go for you?
I almost had a breakdown. I had to call my editor. I was on assignment, and I was just like, I can't do this. It was just
24
What were you
consecutive
seeing?
hours?
I pitched Rolling Stone. I was just like, they were doing one of their movie marathons, and they're just like, we're showing every single MCU.
Oh, right. One of
movie.
those. Yeah.
I remember this piece.
I bring that up. I'm intimately aware of Alamo Drafthouse, and when I saw this news at first, I was like, oh no, because I was reading, I think, Oscar Wars.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's like a chapter in that about, them kind of breaking apart the studios being able to own movie theaters.
Look at you setting up Sean's Film History Corner.
Thank you
And
so much.
That's
And I was
beautiful.
I
The
went-
Paramount degrees.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was a little bit like, is this a monopoly? Not really, because the studios are doing so bad and the movie theaters are doing so bad. But it's like, obviously, Alamo Drafthouse has been going through a lot of just places some of their franchise going into bankruptcy, a lot of other things.
Yeah, there's also controversial
Yeah.
aspects of people who've worked for the company over the years who have not the best reputations. The Paramount decrees are pretty important. This was something that was established in 1948 that effectively eliminated the opportunity for movie theaters, or rather for movie studios, to own the theaters that they are showing their films in. So it is sort of an antitrust decision that held for more than 70 years. It was sort of loosely enforced in the 80s because Reagan rolled back some of this legislation because they looked at all the decrees in American history when Reagan came into office.
Really classic Reagan stuff.
Notable. And
Yeah.
famously not a fan of the government as the president of the United States of America. But still, so some movie studios were sort of like toying with movie theaters over time, and there were some acquisitions, but in 2020, this was officially rolled back. And we saw Netflix acquire the Egyptian and the Paris in New York. Amazon owns its own movie theater in Culver City, where they have to actually show first-run movies. They don't just show Netflix movies the way that Netflix does. But this is a big deal because it could signal what I think more movie studios may consider, which is if you own the space, you can favor your product in a very specific way. And I'm curious what your reaction to this is, because obviously we go to the movies nonstop.
Yeah.
We're in a lot of different kinds of movie theaters. Alamo's not your favorite, but
It is.
it is
not
an
my
interesting
favorite.
option in the orbit of moviegoing in these 25 major cities.
Well, I had a lot of different. Which part do you want me to talk about first? Do you want to talk about the larger, like the
Is it
threat
good
to
for
the
movies?
industry?
Is it bad for movies? I don't know.
I mean, to me, it really feels like an experiment. And like Alamo, in addition to all of the issues that it's had over the past few years, which Charles talked about, and some of which are specific to Alamo and some of which are just part of the fact that movie theaters are like a very tough business. And in some ways, Alamo is better positioned than like an AMC because it has 35 theaters in 25 cities as opposed to like almost 10,000 theaters around the world. And there's just like less of an investment in commercial real estate, which is its own, AMC and Regal and the really big chains have a lot of other business concerns and financial obligations. So this is just kind of like there are 35 theaters. Let's see what happens if we kind of go direct to consumer, just like, like Aesop or Rothy's, like buying a store like in a mall and being like, mostly you could get us online, but now you can get us in a store. But it's maybe like not a loss leader, but to me, this seems more like a marketing experiment or let's see how it goes. And Sony is a studio that is already that has associated itself with the theaters. It does not have its own streaming service. It licenses that to other streaming services. They have been mostly more successful than other theater, studios recently with the theaters. I mean, there is the Madam Web of it all, but otherwise, Anyone But You, Bad Boys 4. So it's in line with what they're trying to do. In their press release, they specifically shouted out Crunchyroll, Charles, which is where you get to come into the conversation, but basically singled out that they would be using it sort of as a marketing thing. And so the smaller scale makes sense to me. And I was like, this is interesting. Maybe it will be a sea change for movie theaters and movies, but to me, this just more seemed like an experiment in two industries that need experiments.
One aspect of those experiments, I think, is related to Crunchyroll, because one of the questions that I have about this is it possible that Sony could create specialized experiences for their movies that would only be available at Alamos? So if there was like a 3D edition of a movie, for example, or if there was like a different way of like an extended cut of a movie that was only being shown in these theaters. Crunchyroll, of course, owned by Sony. They release a lot of anime films. In fact, they've kind of pumped up the number of films they're releasing in theaters in the last 5 years. That seems to be a big initiative for them. They presented at CinemaCon in April, and they had a huge slate of movies to talk about. Most of which I was like, what the fuck is this? This is a movie about volleyball. But nevertheless, I feel like this advantages them in a big way because they have these other products within their studio system that they could favor. Is this like a good thing for Crunchyroll and for anime?
So I think the funny thing about Crunchyroll, for people who don't know what Crunchyroll is, it's basically like a streaming service that is just anime, and it does a very good job of like, this is new for me even in the last couple years, is that when something premieres in Japan, like One Piece or JJK or all of these huge animes, it'll come out on Crunchyroll pretty much at the same time. And I think what's interesting for that is if you like walk into a Barnes & Noble, something has like rapidly changed where it was like, if you go to the US comic book section, it is so small. It is like 1/4 the size. And like, I've gone into like Barnes & Nobles where sometimes the manga section is...
It's the entire bottom
It's
floor of the
huge.
Americana.
Yes,
Yeah, it's massive.
And it's like...
Except for the Blu-rays.
Yes, we have a Criterion shelf, and then otherwise it's just all
It's
manga.
just all manga, anime. Yeah. And I do think if you're Sony, you're thinking, why are we just going to put this movie that's made millions upon millions of dollars in Japan, just throw it on our streaming service? Why don't we do something special in an Alamo? Because I do think if you're thinking of those hyper, just rabid fans like MCU, Star Wars, I do think anime fans are getting to that point where it's like, if you're 10, 11, 12, you probably want to see Demon Slayer more than you want to see, I don't know, Blade.
Yeah.
And I think that might be an investment of like, they're like, oh, we can do this in Alamo. We might be able to do this in other theater chains that we don't even own.
Yeah, I think Alamo is also a theater chain that actually has a personality and actually has a brand, which most do not. You know, AMC obviously has had a interesting turn with the Nicole Kidman ad in recent years and the meme stock aspect.
Right.
But for the most part, like these are anonymous corporations, AMC and Regal and Landmark. And Alamo, you know, whether it's effective or not, it represents something. There is like a sense of humor about the place. There is a little bit of like a hip iconography, for lack of a better phrase, about the way that their theaters are set up. Though LA one is not my favorite Alamo I've ever been to. I've been to a bunch of Alamos over the years. You know, the ones in Texas famously are really, really quite cool. You go to them during South by Southwest.
And those are nice. All of the others that I've been to the one in New York.
Not great.
I mean, yeah, it's not great. And it's a good thing that they're not in the traditional mall space because malls might be back, but obviously like that's been all of the rent that these chains have to pay is a real problem. And I don't know how you solve it. But it's not like Alamo has solved this by picking like great locations that you want to spend a lot. You're like always in a half office park.
Yes, that's definitely the case in LA. I really don't like that building. Yeah.
Alamo's like one is in like Wall Street in just a random building.
Yeah.
And it was just like, it's like cool for what it is. But I do think even as I've just progressed, Alamo probably used to feel a little bit more irreverent and used to feel like, oh, this is cool. I can get a beer, whatever. And I do think in the years since, I'm just like, I don't want to go to Alamo.
Yeah.
So I wonder, can Sony keep that irreverent feel for Alamo, while also maybe papering over a lot of, I don't know, the sliding quality that I've noticed over the
Can we
years.
get better food?
Yeah.
The
food situation's bad.
I mean, that's not something Sony's known for, is their attention to cuisine. So
Like, you never know.
this is interesting. We'll see what happens. Like, I'm not freaking out about it because I
Yeah.
don't know what it means. I think it probably is closer to what you're saying. It's an experiment for Sony to see the fungibility of the theatrical experience.
I think that it could be a precursor to what other studios do with smaller chains or like a small group of theaters. I don't think that this says anything about the future of AMC or Regal or the big chains, just because they have so many other problems to solve.
I would not imagine Disney is looking to buy AMC, for example. You know, like there's not a world really, I think, where Universal buys Regal. That doesn't seem to make sense for their businesses. But, you know, the decree was put in place 70 years ago because at that time there were just a handful of film distribution companies, and they were really trying to control the means of not just production but distribution.
Right.
And because the business, as you said, is like in this weakened state, everybody's like, whatever.
Well,
Let
they
them have
already
it, you know?
also have control distribution because they all have their own streaming
That's exactly
services.
right. That's
So it
exactly
like
right.
did become sort of moot.
Yes.
But, you know, pour one out if you're an AMC stockholder, I guess.